Hi everyone, and welcome back to this lecture in your cultural anthropology class. We're at week 6, and this week we'll talk about two main topics: kinship and family, which really interconnect with one another, and the topic of gender. And you may recall that we've already considered some of these topics in our last focus on politics, law, social order, social control, subsistence. We discussed a lot of these issues with kinship and family, and I made mention of the fact that we would cover this in more depth in this particular set of readings. And then we've also talked about gender in terms of our focus on language when we had that conversation about language and gender. So to begin with, let's jump right into the chapters and get into our topics. So we'll begin with the focus today on family and kinship, and that is going to be chapter 8. As always, you can look at the learning objectives here. We're going to be talking about the significance of family and kinship across different cultures. And one of the things you identify in anthropology is that kinship is a key topic to anthropology. In fact, it's one of the initial topics that I remember learning when I took my very first anthropology classes. Secondly, it's really important to apply cultural relativism because we often discover family patterns around the world and even in our own societies that contrast very differently with the kinds of families of procreation or socialization that we were brought up in. So just important to remember that, because I think a lot of times we see different family forms and we sometimes have negative reactions. For example, in the United States, there's often been a very negative reaction to gay and lesbian parenting and families, as well as a negative reaction to single parent families. So I think this is one of these topics that you see a bit of bias in, both in our political order and how we look at the family, in maybe criminal justice policies or legal policies, as well as in popular culture. And so it's something for us to definitely break down this week as we talk about family and kinship. So starting off, we have the objectives here again. And right here you have an indication, I think, of exactly what I was saying. Family and marriage may seem at first to be familiar topics. Families exist in all societies. They're part of what makes us human. However, societies around the world demonstrate tremendous variation in cultural understandings of family and marriage. Ideas about how people are related to each other, what kind of marriage would be ideal, when people should have children, who should care for children, and many other family-related matters differ cross-culturally. So this is really key. This is, again, one of the key points of anthropology. It's to really think about making the familiar strange and the strange familiar, as we've talked about earlier in this class. I think it's a real challenge in terms of family because a lot of us are brought up in particular types of families. We all are. And then we might use that as our model or our classic prototype, if you will, that we say this is the right way of parenting or this is the right type of family. It's really unfortunate because you meet many other families that are perfectly functional but different from your own in terms of structure, in terms of, again, the parties involved in the parenting, what type of child rearing goes on, and so forth. So it's really an important opportunity for us to suspend our sensibilities that we have about our families and about our kinship systems if it prevents us from respecting and appreciating other family forms out there and other kinship forms out there. So one of the earliest discussions of the family in anthropology, if you go back to folks like Lewis Henry Morgan, very classic anthropologist writing back in 1871, talked about how families often connect to both the status and the role. So as you can see, a status is any culturally designated position that we occupy in a particular setting. For example, you might have father, mother, maternal grandparent, and younger brother. Of course, cultures may define the statuses involved in the family differently. Again, an opportunity there to apply cultural relativism and suspend our belief that we think our way of defining status or role in the family is the right way. A role is the set of behaviors expected of an individual who occupies a particular status. If you take an intro to sociology class, by the way, you talk very much in depth about status and role. And I think by now you're seeing that sociology and anthropology share a lot in common in terms of some of these topics that we're talking about. So again, it goes on to talk about how there are variations in role and in roles and statuses. Now, when we get into kinship, as I just mentioned earlier, kinship is one of those topics that is a classic in anthropology. And I think in contemporary anthropology, since the years in the 90s when I was in my master's and PhD program, there's a lot of debate about the extent to which kinship should be covered in anthropology. So-called old school anthropologists who maybe are more traditional probably cover kinship a little bit more. I tend to think it's important But I sometimes also feel that when we get into the depth of kinship diagramming, even though some anthropologists say it's a great exercise, I sometimes question the extent to which we study kinship. And I think it would be more interesting to take kinship concepts and apply them in settings where it matters. For example, adoption. For example, debates about gay and lesbian marriage. Debates about traditional marriage, so-called traditional marriage, like in a patriarchal context. Debates about different ways in which we approach parenting, issues related to children and education and homeschooling. Those kinds of issues I think are a little more relevant to us than simply doing the kinship diagrams. It's still important to understand this, don't get me wrong, but I just question a little bit some of the approaches that some anthropologists take when they talk about kinship in terms of the application side of things. Now, it can be very interesting, and we'll talk about this later, as far as some of those applications of the classic kinship diagrams in anthropology. Now, when we talk about kinship, two general types of relations we discuss: consanguineal or blood-based relationships, and then affinal or based on marriage. Now, of course, there's also kinship that they say here that is called chosen kin. In the old days in anthropology, we would call these fictive kin relations. Some people are concerned that the word fictive might be pejorative. I don't think it is, because a lot of people have people very close to them and they consider them family. I have a neighbor down the street who has a very close person to her that she considers family, but actually isn't related through blood or marriage. So you often see this in many societies, including in the United States, if you're from or live in the United States. So I think it's important just to remember that kinship can include blood, marriage, and then also those fictive, created, or chosen forms that do not necessarily have to be based on any formal legal ties or blood-based descent type ties. Speaking of descent, we get into a slew of types of descent. In the old days in anthropology, I remember my intro cultural classes, we had multiple choice tests and we had to memorize all these, and that's perfectly fine. It's important to know some of the key concepts, but again, don't get too caught up in the terms to the sacrifice of getting into the real nitty-gritty political and applied issues that we might talk about with our own cultural experiences with kinship and the family. Two main types of descent. Does it come through the male line or does it come through the female line? We call it patrilineal descent and matrilineal descent. And actually, I just got this new board from the college. Thank you to the college for providing it. And I thought maybe this would be a good example of a good way actually to use it, if I can get it in screen here and in focus. And actually, I was just looking online because you might be interested in getting your own experience with kinship. This chart here that I have online is actually pretty good, and it identifies the main ways that we approach doing kinship diagrams. So if you have someone who is a female, it'd be indicated as a circle, a male would be a triangle, and connected to issues of gender identity and also issues of related to transgender community, we have a square for someone who identifies as neither sex or both sexes. So very important to note that. So as we start to look at this, we also can learn some things. If someone is deceased, you would put a line through the kinship symbol. Just looking through this here, and you can look here as well. If someone is married, we often will use this here, an equal sign. And then we could get into descent. So let's say that this couple had children. Okay, and then maybe this person here was married and had children. So whenever you track descent, again, if it's matrilineal, it goes through the female line. If it's patrilineal, it goes through the male line or the father's line. So what you kind of remember when you do this is it's almost like plumbing. So you continue to trace someone who is in your descent system. You continue to trace through the line. And it would actually stop here since we get to a male child. But basically, in either case, you would trace it through either all the females or the males who appear below as offspring. Now, of course, when we're using non-traditional gender identification, this could change. And in a lot of societies, of course, we don't track descent maybe as people do in traditional senses, and there's a lot of variation. The same neighbor I was just talking to, who has the person who's considered a created kin, was talking about how she did her will and how she decided on leaving her estate, and it really had nothing to do with biology or marriage. So I think that's kind of interesting as well, as you could make someone executor of your will, or you could decide to give people a certain amount of money or certain possessions, but it doesn't have to be based on some of those traditional descent systems that we sometimes consider in cultural anthropology. So again, look at some of these kinship diagrams online, because I think they can be really useful to just getting a little bit more information about how this works, because it sometimes does get confusing. We also talk about bilateral descent, which happens, that descent happens from both the father's and the mother's side of the family. So bilateral descent, of course, is pretty common in the U.S., and that would radically alter how your descent diagram would look like if you're tracing descent in terms of your kinship diagrams. And as they see here, anthropologists like kinship diagrams because they help visualize descent in groups. Figure 2 here is an example of a kinship diagram. And you see some of the terms that we talked about. The square also gets used sometimes for ego, so there's kind of variation in this. You might see a square meaning it's you, so if you placed yourself on the kinship diagram, if you were, let's say, an offspring here, and you had a sister, and you were male, then you could put a square there. Again, it sometimes means, I don't know if you could see that, it sometimes means that it could be a non-traditional gender identification that we would also use to indicate the square. So you might see some overlap here with different kinship diagrams. But again, ego could be the starting point. And in anthropology classes, when we ask you to create kinship diagrams, we often say, okay, start with ego and yourself and move up or move down if you have children. If you don't have children, you would just kind of move up, and then you try to list all your various elders and relatives. And sometimes it's really hard to do. And for any of you that go online, use Ancestry or any of the other descent or kinship programs, you can do a lot of this, and it's super sophisticated. In fact, it allows you to fill in gaps that you might not know about in terms of some of your elders that maybe you never realized existed. Pretty sophisticated stuff. Some of it you have to pay for, but I think it could be worth it if you're really interested in doing genealogy studies. Now here's an example again of a patrilineal household with ego and the family's with ego in the father's lineage. Again, what happens is the minute you get to a male, you continue to go. If you don't, if it's female, you stop there. Okay, so the reason these two individuals would not be included in a patrilineal descent system in this particular household is because patrilineal goes through the male line. So as you can see, you continue here, they get included. If these people had children, they could be included as well. Again, you get to here, you stop, you get to here, the male, you keep going. And so it's kind of like, again, a plumbing system, whether it's matrilineal or patrilineal. So very easy to remember and to do. Some additional examples here. This is a matrilineal household, as we talked about. Again, if you're tracing matrilineal descent, every time you get to a female, you continue. If you get to a male, you would stop, and it wouldn't continue. So very easy kind of to remember that. There's some really good discussions of kinship examples from various societies. And what I like about these is they really identify that there are huge differences out there in terms of how different cultures conceive of kinship. So important, again, to really bring in that cross-cultural information to bear on our understandings of kinship in the family. So next we get into a discussion of kinship terms. And very specifically, there are different types of kinship systems. We've often referred to the American system as the Eskimo system. Sometimes Eskimo, by the way, is pejorative, and they also mention this is actually the Inuit people. I think the tradition has been to call it Eskimo because that's just been passed down through the world of anthropology. So you have a Hawaiian kinship system, you have an Eskimo kinship system, Iroquois. They give an example here from Croatia. And what's very interesting about the examples from other cultures, again, is they radically contrast with how we perceive of kinship. So in some kinship terminology systems, maybe you refer to all the people who are your relatives older than you as uncle or aunt. instead of grandmother. So again, our system, in the Eskimo system, where we say there's a grandmother and there's, cousins and cross cousins and there are aunts and uncles and so forth, that doesn't apply to every culture out there. And that's why we have these different terminologies. So we could diagram and map out how different cultures look at kinship. And you have an example from Chinese society and then classic Navajo society. And then also an example from the United States. One interesting thing I will say about this is I've always found, even before I was an anthropologist, and you'd think as an anthropologist I'd find it easier, but I don't. I've always found our system, the so-called Eskimo system, to be very complicated when you get into certain types of relatives, and sometimes it's just hard to remember. You say like, okay, if that person is married and then they are not a sister or a brother or they're an aunt or an uncle, what's their relationship to you? What do you call that? Different types of cousins, once removed and so forth. For me, it gets very confusing, and that's why I like the genealogy programs that you can get, including on Ancestry, because they really help you map it visually. And having these visual maps, I feel, of our kinship systems, of descent systems, of our terminology systems that we're talking about in this chapter, makes it a little easier, I think, just to understand it in that visual sense. And that's why it's great to go online and take advantage of some of those programs available. Now we can talk about marriage in the family. As they say here, in the biological sense, women give birth, and the minimal family unit in most, though not all societies, is mother and child. Now, of course, with gender variation, with a lot of differences worldwide happening in terms of marriage, in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of forms of gender, a lot of this has changed. And so when we get into gay and lesbian marriage, a lot of this, I think, is challenged in terms of the biological significance of parenting. As well, I saw a recent movie for one of the new Marvel movies that Angelina Jolie is in. And you know that Angelina Jolie and her partner Brad Pitt have adopted a number of children. And so I think also because of adoption and non-traditional or blended families in many cultures, we also challenge sort of the biological supremacy of childbirthing as something that has to define a family. It doesn't have to, and in fact, adoption, in my opinion, should be promoted in many societies because we have an issue with children who need parents. And it's always interesting to me, by the way, in societies that have like a pro-life movement where people say, we're against abortion. Well, are you against adoption then? Because if you don't care about adopted kids not having parents and families, or foster kids not having parents and families, you're very concerned about unborn children, but not concerned about children who are born and who actually have a real need. I know that gets very political and religious, but it is a contradiction, in my opinion, when you start talking about some of these people in our society and other societies who don't really respect adoption, focus on it in a primary sense, or focus on dealing with foster kids and their needs. In the U.S. society, we have what's often called serial monogamy, and it means you marry, divorce, remarry, and it's kind of a pattern. And so if you're doing a kinship diagram, it could get very complex because you would use probably this symbol a lot, the not equal sign, and then continue to indicate the marriages and the remarriages and so forth. When anthropologists talk about family structures, we distinguish between different types of families. The first is a nuclear family, parents who are in a culturally recognized relationship, such as a marriage. We can also talk about the conjugal and the non-conjugal nuclear family. The extended family would be the generations that extend beyond the nuclear family, so your grandparents and so forth. We could also talk about a joint family that might include multiple generations. Adult children of one gender remain in the household with spouses and children, and they have collective rights to family property. And then we also have polygamous families or group marriage where plural marriages involve multiple husbands or multiple wives living together with their children, other relatives, and so forth. Now, anthropologists also talk about marriage practices. Very easy to remember the two main types. If you know endo and exo, like endoskeleton and exoskeleton, you already know this. So endo is like within and exo is without or beyond. So endogamy means you have to marry within a particular cultural group. Exogamy means you're allowed to marry outside of a particular cultural group. In the United States, there probably are situations where people or parents, relatives define marriages based on religion or social class. I think sometimes endogamy happens in the U.S., by like almost default, but unspoken. So if very wealthy families hang out with one another, maybe eventually some of their kids get together and marry. And in a sense, that's a form of endogamy because it's based on class and the fact that they are very much focused on having relations only within their social class groups. We can talk about patrilineal cross cousins as well, so look that section over. And then arranged marriages are common in many parts of the world, including the U.S., where families decide for a various reason, for one reason or another, that people should marry within the same group, and maybe they're going to then set up particular people for that marriage. Could be considered a controversial practice, but some people have reported being perfectly happy being in what we call arranged marriages. Now, we can look at the different types of polygamy, polygyny, and these are somewhat easy to remember. We know that polygyny, with the gyne on the end, refers to one husband and multiple wives. Polygamy, if you will, which we had up here, refers to multiple spouses. It is not specific to being husbands or wives. We also have serial forms of polygyny, and then polyandry is a form of marriage where there's one wife and multiple husbands. So easy to remember, polygyny is the husband and multiple wives. Andry, and think of the roots andry and gyne, if you remember those. Polyandry refers to one wife, multiple husbands, and then polygamy refers to a specific of husbands or wives. It just means multiple spouses. We also have group marriage, which is not just one and multiple of the other sex, but multiple spouses in general. We can also talk about family size and how family size has an impact on the makeup of the family, and there's also consideration here about what an ideal family size might be. And it's interesting in the United States that some people say the ideal family might be 2 children and one of each gender. Kind of gets interesting, and I find it a little interesting. By the way, I don't have children, don't plan to have children, and I actually would encourage some of you out there to think about this in terms of your own kinship, that you should not feel forced into having kids. Sometimes your parents or friends will pressure you into having children, and I think it's an important choice, particularly as the world is moving in the directions that we see with environmental challenges and economic challenges. It may not be right for all of you to have children, and I would encourage some of you to critically think about it and don't feel that you have to have children if you don't want to have children. And there's some actually great readings out there from sociology I can advise you on if you're interested that talks about reasons not having kids. One of the great reasons actually is reducing your carbon footprint on the planet. I think a lot of people, in my opinion, want to have children often because they feel like it's a form of destiny, maybe even form of genetic destiny, which can be problematic, I feel, because we don't often focus enough on adoption and the fact that we don't need a biological clone of ourselves and our genes to have really good relations with offspring, with our children. So something else to think about in terms of not having children and again being open to adoption and not having biological children. We can talk about different types of families and different types of households and domestic groups, so you can look over this information. And then as far as patterns of marriage, there's a lot of marriage traditions that anthropologists talk about. For example, if a couple is married, who pays for the wedding? Who pays for aspects of the service or a reception? In the United States, you have forms of that, where sometimes it might be the bride or the groom's family paying for the wedding and then the other family for the reception. Not always the case. Some people elope, as I did with my wife, and don't necessarily have a big ceremony. So there's so much variation again, and it's really important for us to consider that variation happens even in our own cultures. So the dowry, the bride price, or the bride wealth is some establishment of a relationship between the families, the children, say, being married of 2 families, and having to work for one or the other family. Bride price, bride wealth, and also a dowry, which could be more of a monetary or goods gift to one of the families. Family procreation, family of orientation, so where the children are raised or the families are raised refers to a family of orientation, and then a new household for raising children is called the family of procreation. What happens is anthropologists are interested in once a couple gets married and they assume they move out of the family's household, if they were in one of the family's household separately or together as a couple and they move out, what would that residence pattern look like? So you could have either the family moves in with the father. We call that patrilocal residence. It could also be in matrilineal societies avunculocal residence, where they live with the uncle in the uncle's location. Could also be neolocal. I think neolocal is pretty common in the United States, where you just set up your new space and you're not living with relatives. Now, that being said, you watch a lot of home improvement shows, and often when a couple is working on their home and trying to get it improved, they often will move in with one of the parents, or maybe even trade off. If both parents, say, live in that general vicinity, they will live with them for a while. We can have patrilocal residence that we connect back to our discussion of patrilineal descent, and conversely matrilocal residence that's connected with matrilineal descent. We can have bilocal residence or ambilocal residence, where you could live in two locations, kind of like I mentioned with the home improvement shows, or ambilocal residence, where you live in either location. Doesn't really matter, say, the location of either of the two families of the couple. When we talk about inheritance, again, it's a really big deal because inheritance is often defined by our kinship systems. Although I think a lot of times we're seeing shifts where people are relying more on creative or fictive kin networks and not relying on biology or marriage for all matters of descent and wealth inheritance. Same-sex marriage, also very important to consider. You get some really good examples from Native American groups, the idea of a third gender category, and say the tradition of the Bardash, which we often see among Native American societies. Also, the Hijras in India are a very interesting group to look at, of a gender that is really in between. And actually, they're often responsible, the Hijras, this particular group in Indian society, they're sometimes responsible for conveying, fertility on couples, and also being involved in marriage and other aspects. We talked about adoption, and again, I think adoption is really important consideration. They mention the tradition of adopted daughter marriage by the late anthropologist Marjorie Wolf, who worked in Taiwan. I actually worked with Marjorie as a graduate student at the University of Iowa. Tragically, she passed away a few years ago. She was really influential in Chinese anthropology, and someone that a lot of us enjoyed working with in terms of studies of ethnography and feminist anthropology. So I'm happy to see that they mention Marjorie's work here in our textbook. Families and culture change. So this is really key. I think as you're considering these topics this week, think about how family and marriage is changing. Again, really put on that cultural relativism hat or filter and look through the lens of relativity to understand practices around the world and realize that not everybody is the same. Just because you come from a particular kinship or marriage tradition doesn't mean that other people share that in your own culture or in other cultures around the world. So a lot of good stuff there. I think, as usual, try to apply some of the case studies here to your own experiences in the discussions. I think it's a very useful way to approach conversations with the material as opposed to just learning abstract categories. I'd rather you do some applied work with kinship and marriage than just focusing on remembering what patrilocal resonance is or what bilateral descent is or whatever. So kind of important to remember that applied focus. We'll get to the media and also the readings here in a little bit, but let's cover both chapters fully. So chapter 10, I would say somewhat related, maybe really related, because as we get into gay and lesbian marriage, as we get into gender dynamics of, say, descent and patrilineal societies versus matrilineal, we probably get into a lot of these issues. So these are the objectives. This will be chapter 10. We're jumping over 9 for this week, kind of trying to tie together like-minded chapters. And then we'll get into the reading. So click on chapter 10 and open up the PDF. And by the way, I think this is one of the most important topics you'll get in anthropology. If you're really jazzed about gender and sexuality as a topic, I encourage you to take our Social 114 class. I've taught that class for over 25 years. We have a new full-time instructor in sociology now, but definitely take that class because it will get into a lot of these issues that are covered here, even in our anthropology class. Okay, so sex and gender, according to anthropologists. So this is a really key issue. And the key thing to remember here, and people always, kind of mess this up, and I think it's because a lot of times on forms that we fill out, it'll say sex or gender, or actually it'll say probably gender when it means sex. So sex traditionally is something that is biological, and then gender is something that is cultural. And we generally say this is fluid, gender is fluid, and biology is more fixed. Now, when we get into transgender issues, we can debate about what is really fixed. So this is kind of the traditional definition. But just to remember this, sex is generally biological and more fixed, and gender is cultural and more fluid or constructed. The problem is this. The problem is people make assumptions that sex defines your gender. So the classic example would be, you have a boy and you say, well, this boy is born a male biologically in terms of chromosomes, genitalia, physiology, and so forth. And you say, because that boy is born a boy, a male, that boy is masculine. That's where the flaw happens. The flaw happens when people start to assume that this impacts the other. Now, it can, but it doesn't mean that if you're born a male, that's going to determine that you're only masculine. And the issue that comes up is because we have a very fixed and static and non-fluid and non-constructed notion of gender, we get into all kinds of trouble and we say, well, boys shouldn't wear dresses, or girls shouldn't play with trucks, or do boys' sports, or whatever. When we start to even define by the color of clothing, the toys, a great way to study gender, and how gender, what we call essentialism, where we say there's an essence to being a boy and it means this, or there's an essence to being a girl and it means this. That often plays out in the world of toys. I often would assign for my gender students an activity where you'd go to Target or Walmart and look at the toy selection and try to see how dramatically they're dialectically arranged for boy versus girl or male versus female. So very problematic when we confuse the two. So the number one thing you can get out of this chapter is a very simple, though it's not simple because we mess it up, fact that biology refers to sex, whereas gender refers to a constructed, fluid, flexible, non-static category. Really problematic because a lot of us, I think, are born to believe a certain way, and sometimes their parents influence us and say, if you're a boy, you need to act this way. If you're a girl, you need to be passive. Those are fully constructed, essentialized notions of how boys and girls should act. When we get into issues of the transgender community, the non-cisgender community, if you're not transgender, we refer to you, like myself, as cisgender. When you get into transgender issues, further opportunities to really dismantle categories that should be seen as more fluid and less fixed and less static. But we run into all kinds of problems because we bring these essentialist notions of gender and sex to our everyday life situations. And a lot of that happens through parents, through relatives, through peers, and even through the media. As you're watching TV shows, if they have a very normalized or essentialized notion of masculinity, being a super buff guy who beats people up, like in the old action films, and a woman who's passive and sexualized and uses her body instead of her mind to get ahead in that movie and the cultural situations of it, those are showing you the real essentialized and normalized problems with gender and sex. Normalization, by the way, means that you start to make something normal. You say, well, it's normal for girls to be very thin and not to eat and not to use their minds and to focus on their body as a tool. That refers to normalization, where it seems normal to people in society. Again, the goal of anthropology and the social sciences is to dismantle and deconstruct our very cherished notions that shouldn't be cherished. They're only cherished because they're constructed. The problem is, like if you read French philosophers like Michel Foucault, The History of Sexuality, he would tell us that this process of normalizing gender and sexuality and sexual practices in our society results in us being unable to see visibly. These are invisible categories or notions that affect our everyday behavior, and thus we get into all sorts of situations and trouble because we're allowing ourselves to become victims of that normalization and essentialism that is constructed and created in society, but we don't see it as constructed and created, we see it as natural. And that's the other thing you can tie to sex. You can often say that people assume that because one's biological sex is natural, then the same thing is going to apply to gender, and that's certainly not the case. So, Important here because this stuff, certainly the last chapter too, but this stuff really affects people's lives. If you're denied an opportunity as a woman or a member of the LGBTQ plus community or a transgender person or someone who doesn't fit a particular role defined by society, you're denied a work opportunity. Well, that's a real life consequence of sex and gender, and that's why we need to talk about this. Again, this is really clear to talk about the difference between sex and gender, the biological versus the cultural. Biological determinism is another concept that goes along with notions of essentialism and this idea of how things are normalized in our society. One example of that would be to say if you're a woman, you need to have children because women have children. So that's a form of essentialism, of biological determinism. So one way to reject biological determinism is to really challenge stereotypes. As they say here, in culture to culture, what is masculine and feminine varies. Pink and blue, for example, are culturally invented gender color linkages, and skirts and makeup can be worn by men, indeed by warriors. Many Hindu deities, male and female, are highly decorated and difficult to distinguish, at least by conventionalist, masculinist U.S. stereotypes. So that gender blurring, I think, is something you see more happening in the real world. In fact, if you're interested in this, you could click on, or just look this up, Facebook's gender terminology. And I think maybe I linked it for this week. I'll find out in a second. I'm forgetting because I use this all the time. But one of the cool things about Facebook, and people are maybe a little mad at Facebook at this current time in 2021 because of some of the issues related to the whistleblower scandal. But Facebook will allow you to pick a number of 58 different gender categories. And this is an indication that Facebook and other companies are realizing that we can no longer use these essentialized and oppressive categories of a patriarchal society, of a society maybe that has been homophobic and very ciscentric in terms of not focusing on transgender issues. So this allows for more fluidity and less of that dialectic of male and female or masculine and feminine. And all anthropologists would agree that all of us have both masculine and feminine characteristics. Again, societies define these differently and often say we expect certain people to fill certain roles or statuses, to go back to our last chapter on kinship and marriage. But we need to be very aware that these categories are all constructed and there's nothing natural about them, regardless of what people say politically or in terms of various religions. Now, we can talk about biological sex and again, emphasize again and again, it's a different thing than one's gender, which is a social, historical, and constructed fact. So again, it's a real challenge because a lot of people assume that everybody who is born male should be masculine and everybody who's born female should be feminine. And this talks a little bit about gender variation and gender variability in a couple of the authors' classes. So moving beyond the gender binary, I think this is where that Facebook information is going, or that Facebook approach that clarifies that there are multiple gender categories is. We need to move beyond this binary or dualistic model of gender, assuming that there are two sexes or assuming that there are only two genders. Gender is a variation. And in fact, if you look at race and ethnicity, people are saying similar things. So we could say if something is a continuous variable, it falls into a few key categories. So maybe you could have cis gender males and females, and then cisgender, and then transgender individuals. But, other ways to think about gender would be to consider something as more fluid and continuous. So we could talk about gender as something that ranges between certain masculine and feminine characteristics or qualities. And again, even that might be problematic because we might say, well, maybe we should move beyond just saying there's a masculine and a feminine at two extremes, because these would maybe be the extremes. Instead, we should just, have a model of maybe plotting, different types of gender identities, almost like, subsets or something. And then that would reflect what we saw here in the Facebook study where they were talking about all the fluidity and variation of gender. But I love the author's focus on the need to move beyond this binary assumption. I mentioned the Hijras in the last chapter. They're discussed here, so definitely take a look here. As a possible third gender category, they are typically biological males, but they adopt female clothing, gestures, and names. They often don't take part in sexual activity. They go through various religious rituals that confer them certain powers, including blessing or cursing couples' fertility and performing at services like weddings and births. So very interesting just to think of these other examples out there. And the book doesn't mention as much, but I encourage you to look at Margaret Mead's classic study in Papua New Guinea of different gender categories and how you could see examples in a very small society of different cultures that have women acting as more sort of outwardly aggressive and forceful males, like in the stereotypical version of masculinity in the US. And then you have males in that same culture who act more like passive, arts-focused, domestic sphere-focused individuals as women in the classic, say, 1950s stereotype in the U.S., the Stepford Wives or something like this, are expected to act. So you see that variability, and because of that in a very small society, and you see some examples here of Gilbert Hurt's focus on the Sambia and Papua New Guinea, because of that variation that happens in a very small place, wouldn't it make sense that there's a ton of variation in a large place like the United States with all different ethnic groups, social groups, different cultures coming in because of expatriation and people immigrating to the U.S. and so forth. So we can also talk about issues of gender differentiation and how it could relate to very specific problems where sometimes, say, men are only assigned to the public sphere and women are assigned to the domestic sphere. It seems to me one opportunity in the U.S., and again, I don't assume that couples are going to necessarily be straight couples, so we should assume there could be same-sex couples in the United States just as there are in other parts of the world. And I challenge you a little bit. I think if you're in work, I've heard this before, sometimes people give what we call a heteronormative example. So you give an example where you say, well, in a marriage, a man and a woman, you say, wait a second, don't assume that every marriage is between a man and a woman. The other thing I sometimes hear when people give examples is this very situation here of the male being public and the female being domestic. So someone will give an example in a training. I heard this happen once, and they said, well, the woman, she's, married to this man, and when he comes home, he says, where's my dinner, honey, or something like this. And I'm like, in the 2000s, the 2020s, to be giving examples where you assume A, that it's a heteronormative couple, that it's a man and a woman, is highly problematic. B, you're assuming that the woman is staying home, taking care of the kids, making dinner, and cleaning the house. Don't make that assumption. There are many families where, again, it's not heteronormative, it's a same-sex family, and there are many families, regardless of the status of a male, female, same-sex, or opposite-sex relationship or partnership, there are many families where it's not traditional in terms of who is doing the domestic work and who's doing the outside of the house work and so forth. So again, these assumptions, I still hear them, and I even hear them from educators saying it. It's shocking when I hear it, but I try to approach it, and I hope you will as well, really challenge these assumptions as you encounter them in everyday life. Again, gender has a direct consequence on all of our lives. People die because of gender. People die because of gender essentialism. People die because of gender normativity and these assumptions we make. We have to then make the intervention in our own lives and practice what we call intellectual self-defense and challenge the stereotypes, challenge the essentialism, challenge the naturalization of categories that, appear maybe to you to be biological and fixed, but when in reality are fluid, constructed, and needing to be challenged. You could say I get kind of worked up about this because, again, I think we have so many issues related to this in all of our societies that we study. We can see some alternative models of gender, maybe situations where you don't have gender segregation or gender hostility. So I think it's very interesting. Look at these examples because they could be good models for us to follow in whatever culture we happen to live in and exist in. This is why I think anthropology has so much value, is you can use these cross-cultural examples to challenge our own revered assumptions, to go back to the familiar and the strange. Make the strange familiar, make the familiar strange. Other gender myths are out there, and archaeologists certainly have been involved in perpetuating some of these myths, like Man the Hunter and other origin stories of gender. So Man the Hunter, we often talk about in archaeology. It's assuming that because males were often hunting in hunter-gatherer societies and women were gathering berries and other food substances and maybe procuring foods, we assume, well, the male work is more important because you get a big form a big game, you bring it home, that provides for a lot of calories. But all the other stuff that happens to that game when you bring it back to camp and you have to skin it if it's an animal and cook it, and all the cleanup and all the work that gets done if you're saving parts of the animal for hide or whatever, very important work. And just because the males are the ones maybe killing the animals doesn't mean that that's most important, and thus it sort of suggests that Man the Hunter is stereotypically the more importance because it seems to be more important to the diet or the sustenance of that family or tribal unit. So this kind of really deconstructs that, so take a look at it. And as they say here, we want to replace stories with reality. So if we're told certain stories, say even about primates, and there's a whole gendered focus among primates, if you read the work of Emeritus Professor Donna Haraway, UC Santa Cruz History of Consciousness program, she wrote a really amazing book I read as an undergraduate called Primate Visions, and it was really a feminist approach to understanding primatology and some of the gender stereotypes and assumptions that primatologists were bringing to their work. In other words, they were assuming certain patterns of gender based on, baboons, the sex of the baboons, that were more about stories being told or created than about realities or science. So this is a really good section of the book that really will connect you to work in archaeology as well. If you ever do work in feminist archaeology, I think you'll get into a lot of these conversations. A little more then about mothering and motherhood and what it means. And then talking about family and marriage as both a cultural construct and social invention. So this is something that goes along really nicely with the conversations we've been having this week then in week 6 about marriage, family, and also then about gender. Just important to remember that anything that is natural or assumed to be natural is maybe very likely a cultural construct, and we need to treat it as such and not make decisions that, again, affect people in life and death sorts of ways, in monetary ways, in ways relating to power. We should make those decisions if we're using forms of gender essentialism or gender naturalism or normalization, whatever we want to call it. So really good case studies to look at, and examples here about egalitarian societies and maybe how we can do some work to really challenge the inegalitarian forms of family that we sometimes see, say, in the United States, where males have a certain form of power or have certain rights and abilities that females don't have. Again, if it's a hetero family, and a lot of variation out there to discuss, and a lot of power dynamics in all forms of families that we might consider in anthropology. The question of male dominance, we often refer to this as patriarchy. A patriarchal society is a male-dominant society. I think the question here for an anthropologist is it something universal? Is it rooted in biology? What can we really say to understand contexts of power in society where males maybe sometimes have had more power than females in those societies? And then some new directions forward in terms of the anthropology of gender. They don't talk too much in this chapter, and this is something you see a little bit in anthropology that irks me a little bit, is they don't talk about pop culture. Pop culture, I guess, would be considered normally maybe in our Social 102 class, the sociology class on family and marriage. But as anthropologists, we can talk about pop culture as well. And one thing I would really encourage you to do as we move forward is to really ask some questions about how some of these stereotypes or issues are reflected in our media, are reflected in video games. There's a lot of conversations about how women are often presented as objects of sexual desire, as passive objects, as opposed to men, say, in video games or in television shows. Hopefully, we're seeing more variation in today's day and age, but we probably, unfortunately, still see some of this in our media. So check out our media system to understand more of this, and I'll talk about this in some of the links as well. Now, heteronormativity, again, we talked about Foucault. I'm happy that they mentioned Foucault. It's the idea that we assume that what's normal in a society is a heteronormative, using the word normative in there. That's the normal family, not a gay and lesbian family, or a family that's based on group marriage or other variations. So really important to look at this. Also, the focus on the transgender community, again, if we refer to the cisgender community, we're talking about people who do identify between their gender orientation and their bodies versus transgender community who identify a gender different than the one that was assigned to them at birth. Anthropologist David Valentine talked about transgender categories in the United States. I had a chance years ago to hear him speak when he was at Rice University. And I think a lot of people heard about Caitlyn Jenner in the news. There's been some series, I Am Kate, for example, kind of a spin-off almost of the Kardashian clan's various series. A lot of people were really upset with Caitlyn Jenner, saying that she really hasn't been a good role model for the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about some of the ways in that short series, which was not renewed, called I Am Kate. It actually was interesting because it was really challenging sort of essentialist assumptions that someone who is transgender could have about gender, about biology, about culture, and so forth. So really good discussion here about transgender populations and the LGBTQ plus community. And by the way, when we talk about LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus, over the years, this particular acronym will change over time. And in fact, that's another indication of what Facebook is doing in terms of their notion of gender fluidity. These acronyms should change over time because very clearly there's more understanding that gender is fluid and cultural and open and often chosen. Very recently, in 2021, you may know the comedian Dave Chappelle produced and filmed his last show, his $20 million deal that he gets per episode, per comedy special, called The Closer. And he said a lot of things that were very offensive to people, a lot of things about the transgender community. And I encourage you to maybe look at some of the online conversations about this, because comedy is very interesting. Comedy often is poking fun at people. But what I find troubling about Chappelle, and he's someone I supported over the years as a really conscious political comedian, you know, there's comedy and then there's just targeting communities and being mean to communities. There have been some people that have been fired at Netflix over their speaking out related to the Chappelle controversy. So it'd be interesting to talk about some of this and maybe have some conversations in our discussions this week if you're interested. Again, people who identify with the sex and gender assigned at birth is referred to as cisgender. Very important that there's a term for this, because for so often people just said there are transgender people. What do you call non-transgender people? And by having the term cisgender, you relativize the notion that somehow being transgender is different or odd or abnormal. In this way, to quote kind of back to Foucault's notions of normalization, you take away that notion that one approach to gender and to sexual identification, or to sex identification rather, is somehow natural, assigned at birth, or whatever. Now, you can also use terms like gender queer and gender fluid to realize that sometimes there's a fluidity and some people choose to be gender non-conforming and therefore do not even like any of these labels. So I think that's interesting as well. A lot of really good discussions here about changing attitudes in terms of LGBTQ plus communities in the United States. You can see this major decision by the Supreme Court in 2014, 2015 had a lot of impact on legal rights of same-sex marriage. So long that it took for this to happen. Unfortunately, I think we've seen some during the Trump years, some movement backwards a little bit in terms of the rights of members of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think it's just important to always keep this focus on our minds when we think about our political decisions that we make in our everyday lives, and again challenging some of these assumptions. So you see again a little bit attempt here to focus on family photos that do not fit like the traditional notions of a family photo, and that is really a progressive move to talk about this. And then talking about sexuality outside the United States. So you see a lot of examples outside the US, again, that really confirms the fluidity of gender, the fluidity of sexual orientation, and so forth. We can also talk about the anthropology of the body and how the body often relates to gender. And this could relate to issues of reproduction. It could also relate to sports. I know there's been a lot of controversies in sports connected to women's bodies and how women's bodies are supposed to look versus male bodies, say, in various competitive sports. Also, women in anthropology. And this is kind of interesting, just talking about how women have faced very specific challenges in terms of field work. I mentioned the work of the late Marjorie Wolf earlier in terms of feminist anthropology, so I think this section is certainly in line with some of her work. And then talking about academic anthropology in the U.S., where sometimes it's been dominated by males and certain approaches in terms of salaries. This is a really progressive chapter because I feel like the author is really hitting a lot of issues that you wouldn't typically get unless you're taking a graduate class in anthropology talking about feminist anthropological issues or gender issues in anthropology. And also a little more focus here on masculinity studies in gender classes. Mentions the work of Jackson Katz, Tough Guys. You can actually check out on our library website that particular video if you're interested, and I can point to more of such videos if you're interested. So a lot of good information here. I like the focus here at the end on popular culture and some of those media examples that I was talking about earlier. And then there's a good conclusion to read, and then the discussion questions. So an excellent chapter. I think a lot of issues to really ruminate on. Again, provocative issues. I really hope you approach both chapters this week in week 6 from a really challenging perspective, where you challenge traditionalist assumptions from various cultures, including our own culture if you're from the U.S., where people make assumptions that should be challenged in terms of gender, marriage, family, sexual orientation, and so forth. Let's look at some additional readings in media, just to give you a sense of what you might consider here. So there's some good information about kinship. This could be good grounding information, foundational information for you to look at. The kinship of anthropology is kind of also cool to look at, to talk about how anthropologists have considered kinship. And then talking about marriage from an anthropological perspective, a series of good journal articles. And then I really advise you to look at the Global Gender Gap Index, which shows you how various countries are doing in terms of dealing with some of these issues of patriarchy, domestic violence, women being abused, and so forth. Now, the media for week 6 is equally, I think, full of good stuff. So I have quite a bit here on family, kinship, and marriage. So you can check out a few TEDx documentaries and also a classic film with W.H. Pitt Rivers and really good, traditionalist context. I do actually have a kinship diagram maker. So if you want to try one of these out, you could just simply click on this, click on Make Kinship Diagram, and you can get started. I really advise you to look at this because it's a really nice way of learning kinship. In fact, this will show you the basic version of all the kinship charts that we consider here in anthropology. So very fun to use. You can go on here and make changes to anything in terms of the text, in terms of adding more kinship. I think you just drag and drop these, so easy to use. So take advantage of this because that's super useful to be able to have that online to use. In addition, connected more to gender. Again, this is more in the global gender gap, so check this out if you don't want to read the particular article I have there. Also, more about transcending gender binaries, the work of Judith Butler, a very famous post-structuralist feminist critic who is super popular and super important as an intellectual. And then additional examples coming from pop culture, looking at the work of Jean Kilbourne in Ads and Sexism, how sexism affects us, pop culture, video games, and actually a few others here. You can look at other examples that challenge, say, gender normativity, like the Hijras in India that we talked about. You can also look at the myth of man the hunter, woman the gatherer that our author talks about. You can look at expanding understandings via China and other cultures. So take a look at these because I think they really are quite good. Discussion here, very good story about someone who has a transgender girlfriend and how he's adapted to hatred and criticism, and then what cisgender means. So I think the media is really good this week in terms of giving you a range of possibilities of looking at gender, marriage, and the family. And then lastly is a project I've curated for the last, 20 or more years called the Gender Ads Project. I haven't had as much time lately to be able to update this, but it's a series of ads that you can navigate to. and look very specifically at how women and men are presented in various contexts of advertising. You can click on any of these and you can look at the various ads and kind of just get a sense of how, again, stereotypes develop in terms of our world of advertising. So I very much encourage you to look at the Gender Ads Project. In fact, I think I have a section in our discussions for this week that allow you to comment on some of these ads that you may have considered. So that is going to be it for week 6. We looked at family, kinship, and the topics of gender. Again, take a critical perspective to the work as you do the readings this week. Look at the media, look at the additional readings, and engage in your discussion posts and, of course, your week 6 quiz. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with the week 7 lecture.